Right. Hi, everyone. Nice to see all your faces again. Some new ones in this room than last time, and some the same. So we are ready to jump into our 1 o'clock presentation. And so we will be joined by, she just told me Kira, not Kyra, right? Kira and Claire with Hotıì ts'eeda. Perfect. And they will be talking to us about a bit of an introduction to UNDRIP over the next hour. So warm welcome to the two of them. Thanks, Davida, and welcome everybody. There is going to be some group activity in this workshop, emphasis on workshop. I encourage you to sit in 2 or more groups of people. So if you would like to expand your group, now is a good chance to move and join another table. And I've got the clicker. So welcome to Ełet'anıts'eǎh. Thank you again for introducing us. This is an introduction to the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous People. We'd like to respectfully acknowledge the traditional land on which we are delivering this presentation, which is that of the Ta'an Council and the Kwanlun'dun First Nation. I know many of us have traveled to be here today, so if you'd like to learn more about the land that you're on, you can check out this really great resource called native-land.ca. There is a QR code for you. So my name's Claire. I come to this workshop from Irish settler ancestry. I was born in Toronto and then raised in Houston, Texas. My educational background is in public health with an emphasis on Indigenous health research. It's been in the last 10 years that I've begun challenging my colonized view of the world, and that work is largely due to the generosity of Indigenous knowledge sharers sharing with me along the way. I moved to Yellowknife last year when this job opportunity presented itself, and in that time I've learned lots from Northern Indigenous folks and continue to learn. So I'm sharing this workshop with you today from the perspective that we are all on a learning journey, and I look forward to learning with all of you today.
And my name's Kira Hannanen. Thanks for having me here. It's my first time in Whitehorse. So I was born and raised in Yellowknife, NWT. I'm a second-generation Canadian, and my ancestry is primarily Finnish, Dutch, and German. I have a Bachelor of Science in Nursing from UVic. Through my education and my clinical experiences, I had the opportunity to work with and care for Northerners accessing healthcare. And these clinical experiences helped me discover my interest in looking at the bigger picture of healthcare and in research overall. And I also just want to acknowledge that this workshop's the product of the entire Hotıì ts'eeda team, including Clichon Elder, Dr. John B. Zoe, and Dr. Stephanie Erlbacher-Fox. Their work was really instrumental in Hotıì ts'eeda's origin and UNDRIP and our work on it. Next slide, please. So content overview over the next hour. We'll be going over an overview of UNDRIP, what it is, why it matters, and how it can be applied. And you'll get to engage with some UNDRIP articles throughout to support your learning. We're going to keep things really practical by sharing how UNDRIP has shaped and guided the structure and actions of our own workplace, Hotıì ts'eeda. And hopefully by the end, you'll have some key takeaways to help you apply your learning within your own context.
I know you all have lots of materials in front of you. We will explain each of them in turn for the most part. Right now, I'd like you to draw your attention to the orange TRC Truth and Reconciliation booklets. If you don't have one in front of you, check the table. If you still can't find one, raise your hand. My colleague Brandon will help you procure one. So these booklets were published by the National Center for Truth and Reconciliation. They include the TRC's 10 Principles of Reconciliation, the 94 Calls to Action, and the 46 UNDRIP articles. Today, we'll be referencing Section 3, the 46 UNDRIP articles, and you can follow along with the orange circles on the slides that have the page number relevant to the articles that we are talking about.
So let's dive right in, starting with our UNDRIP 101. So, and pictured here are beaded lanyards from Latoya Codron of Hay River. You'll see a bit more of those later, hint, hint. Yeah, but what is UNDRIP? So UNDRIP stands for the United Nations Declaration on the Rights of Indigenous Peoples. This is an international declaration that describes minimum standards for Indigenous human rights worldwide for all governments and institutions to recognize and uphold. UNDRIP does not create new human rights standards. What it does is provides a way to measure whether laws and policies are meeting the human rights of Indigenous peoples. The Declaration specifically mentions Indigenous women's, children's, and elders' rights. It also describes collective rights, which are particularly important because many Indigenous rights are shared, such as ownership of land and resources.
Next, we're going to share a short 2-minute video to help with our understanding of UNDRIP based on a cultural metaphor developed by Dr. Elder John Bezo.
Sometimes it's hard to see how an international document like UNDRIP relates to us. It might help to think about UNDRIP like this. Indigenous peoples' rights are supported by lots of different laws, policies, and agreements. These laws, policies, and agreements are like the strands of a net. A strong net is one where each strand supports the other. When the strands in the net are weak or missing, the net can tear and break. If we neglect the net and allow the holes to grow larger, the net can no longer support Indigenous peoples' rights. The kalaga is a tool used to weave new strands of twine into a fishnet. Indigenous peoples across the Northwest Territories use this tool to weave new nets and mend broken ones. UNDRIP is similar to the kalaga. It is a tool that we can use to fix the tears in the net. It helps us to see where laws, policies, and agreements are weak or not being implemented. When a law or policy is not supporting Indigenous people's rights, we can look at what UNDRIP says about that right to understand what actions must be taken to ensure laws or policy meets the standards that UNDRIP describes. Just like the kalaga can be used to weave broken strands of a net together, UNDRIP can be used as a tool to ensure that our agreements, laws, and policies are supporting Indigenous people's rights. So if we keep working to fix the individual strands today, eventually Indigenous people will have a strong net which can support their rights as they meet the challenges of the future.
Nailed it. So I love when that video works because Elder John Bezo does such a great job of explaining this cultural metaphor. You can see pictured here a kalaga.
So, the history of UNDRIP. Since the early 20th century, Indigenous leaders have brought their concerns to international attention within the United Nations in recognition for governments to respect their rights. In 1982, the Working Group on Indigenous Populations was established by the UN to develop a set of human rights standards for Indigenous peoples worldwide. For over 2 decades, Indigenous people, legal experts, and government officials from all over the world worked to develop the declaration we now know as UNDRIP. UNDRIP was adopted by the United Nations General Assembly in 2007. However, Canada was one of the 4 states which voted against it at that time. In 2016, the Government of Canada finally endorsed UNDRIP and committed to its implementation.
So Hotıì ts'eeda staff identified several categories of rights for the UNDRIP articles. Consider which of these categories is relevant to your work. They include self-determination and self-government, culture and language, land and resources.
Is there support for UNDRIP? Implementing UNDRIP is supported by both the calls to action in the Truth and Reconciliation Commission and the calls to justice in the Murdered and Missing Indigenous Women and Girls Final Report. Both these reports outline priority areas for the Government of Canada to address to begin reconciling their relationship with Indigenous peoples. Of note, in 2019, the Legislative Assembly of British Columbia became the first jurisdiction in Canada to enshrine UNDRIP into law. And currently, the federal government and the government of the Northwest Territories are taking steps to implement UNDRIP. What this may look like is changing policies and institutions to be culturally safe, which will help get to the root cause of poor health outcomes among Indigenous people.
Welcome to our first activity. So we understand that one of the barriers to implementing UNDRIP is making sense of the legal jargon and inaccessible language used. So we're going to practice translating some articles together. I know a few people came in a little bit late. This workshop is based on some group activity, so if you're finding yourself sitting in a relatively small group, feel free to join up with another table. By translating legal jargon, what I mean is taking the language and turning it into something that your children, neighbors, grandparents, whomever else you have in your life might understand. We hope in doing this that you'll become familiar with some of the articles and you'll get comfortable making sense of the legal jargon used in these declarations. Please keep in mind there are no wrong answers. So the way we're going to do this in just a moment, I will change to the next slide. You will read an article. I will give you a couple minutes to translate that into your own language, into your own words. You can pen and paper, pull out a laptop, however you want to take these notes is fine. After a few moments, I will invite people to share back with us and the group what your translation sounds like. Davita's on mic running. Thank you again. And as an expression of our gratitude for your sharing, Brandon will be coming around with beaded lanyards for folks who are brave enough to share with us. So, do we have any questions before the first article? I hear some the beaded lanyard sported here. Okay, no questions. Our first article, 8.1. Oh, do I see a question? Yes, they are in the books. Thank you. I am realizing the orange in this text is not showing up as much as I had hoped. So I will read it out loud and I will tell you which article number it is if you would prefer to read it from your books. Any other questions? Great. We're going to start with Article 8.1, which is on page 114, 114 of your tiny books. And 8.1 reads, Indigenous peoples and individuals have the right not to be subjected to forced assimilation or destruction of their culture. Let's take a minute or two to write our translations. All right, I am so sorry to interrupt because it sounds like there's some really great conversation going. We have about 5 of these that we could go through, but at this rate, we are absolutely not going to get through them, and that's okay, that's great. We're here for the conversation more than we are to get through all the articles. Before I reveal what Kira and I came up with for a translation, would anyone like to share their translation with the group? I see a hand in the back. Thank you so much. I love the enthusiasm.
Did I shut it? Oh, there we go. We were very motivated by the reward.
Yeah.
We wrote, you have the right to practice your culture if you want. You do not have to give up who you are for any reason.
That is a beautiful translation. I like your 2 succinct sentences. I like your use of the word want and choice. Now, Brandon doesn't know this, but putting Brandon on the spot and recognizing that everybody was participating in some really great group discussion. Brandon, I think we have enough beaded lanyards for everybody at that table. Whoa, rockin'. So while that table is choosing their beautiful beaded lanyards, would anyone else like to share their translation? I see another hand. Thank you so much.
We came up with Indigenous peoples have the right to continue their cultural practices without interference.
Great. Also, thank you. I like your use of without interference. As we know, interference has been largely a problem, so it's great that you address that. Here is our translation. Amazing. And somehow that looks clearer to me than the text above, so I'll make note of that. It reads, Indigenous peoples and individuals have the right not to be assimilated, meaning they have the right not to be forced to take up someone else's culture and way of life, and for their culture not to be destroyed. So the reason Kira and I chose this article as one of the examples in this workshop is because of the use of the word assimilated. So both of the examples that we heard made use of other language instead of assimilated. You'll see in our translation that we still use the word assimilated, but we go on to define it. Either of those tactics are perfectly acceptable for translating, again, this inaccessible jargon. If there aren't any questions, we'll move on to the next article. We're gonna make it work. How about we get the next slide? No. Perfect. So we'll leave it right at that. We've moved on to Article 29.2. It's found on page 133, so 133. And that article reads, States shall take effective measures to ensure that no storage or disposal of hazardous materials shall take place in the lands or territories of Indigenous peoples without their free, prior, and informed consent. So let's take another couple minutes to translate that article. All right, teammates, I am sorry to cut off the discussion again. I see many of you writing so quickly to get your thoughts down. It's great to see you all engaging with these articles. Would anybody like to share their translation of Article 29.2? I'm particularly looking at tables that haven't had a chance to share yet. I saw your hand in the black sweater first. But I love the enthusiasm from this table. We are here for it.
Yes, hi.
Hi.
So we translated it as the government isn't allowed to dump or store toxic materials on Indigenous lands prior to getting their consent.
Perfect.
Yep.
I like that you took the word state and turned that into government. I have a whole other article to talk about that point. As someone who was raised in the States, I was very confused and thought they were only talking about the American states, and then realized that that is just legal jargon, and they're actually referring to nation states, such as government can be interchanged. So thank you. Yeah, I did see you guys at the back. I'm sorry. There's also this person down here at the front. We can do both tables and then we'll cut it off for this article. But the excitement is great. Yes.
As caretakers of the land, Indigenous people oversee the use of the land. There should be no use of this land without their permission, especially with hazardous materials.
That's beautiful. Using caretakers of the land, I like that you created a whole picture rather than just focusing on that toxic hazardous waste piece. Thank you again for sharing. And there's Brandon. We're going to have one more share from the back here. Thank you again.
So I made this really in layman terms, and we said First Nations have the right to hunt, fish, harvest the berries and medicines, should be traditional medicines, on their traditional territories, and the government will ensure the land is protected.
Perfect. Also lovely. Thank you. So I don't know if you guys are starting to see that all of our translations sound a little bit different from each other, but they all are getting at what or how this article reads. I'm going to share with you now our translation, which is quite lengthy. Bear with me. It reads, Indigenous peoples have the right to their environment being protected. Governments will respect and protect the right of Indigenous peoples to develop and protect their lands, water bodies, and other natural resources. No dangerous materials should be placed on Indigenous peoples' lands without their free, prior, and informed consent. Governments will protect the health of Indigenous people who are affected by dangerous materials placed on their land. Now, you might say that this translation has some pretty severe or aggressive language, and it does. Your translations don't have to use such strong statements like the government will do this or they will do that. But we did write it in this way to share some examples of actionable items to take these, implementing these articles one step further. The last point I have to say about this article is that we chose it for its use of the phrase free, prior, and informed consent. That shows up across the United Nations declarations, and I wanted to make sure that we're all on the same page about what that means. Our understanding is that in this case, it means Indigenous peoples have the right to be consulted and make decisions on any matter that affects their rights freely without pressure and having all the information before anything happens. Are there any questions before we move on? All right, bear with me. I'm going to flip through a bunch of slides because y'all are doing great on the discussion piece, but it means we are going to move along to some more of the sharing piece. Oh, one too far. So thank you again, everybody that shared. There will be an opportunity for folks to continue sharing. We have a whole second activity. And fortunately, we are not overpopulated in this presentation. So we have a few extra beaded lanyards for folks that didn't get a chance to grab one. Brandon will have those on the table for you when you leave. There's a couple of points I want to emphasize before we move along. We talked about this a lot in the sharing. These articles are written in a way that is inaccessible, difficult to understand, and that will serve as a barrier for folks such as yourself to implement UNDRIP. Any work we can do to better understand these articles is good work. And on one of the handouts, so I told you I'd circle back to some of these, there are QR codes, which will direct you to 2 different translation guides. One was developed by Hotıì ts'eeda staff. One is developed by the UN for a youth audience in particular. I also want to remind folks that we may be inclined to emphasize one part of the article over another. I think we saw a little bit of that in that second translation as well, folks talking about traditional practices, caregivers of the land, and we might be inclined to do that based on our work and life experiences to date. That's also okay and encouraged. Just keep in mind that what is plain language to you may not be plain language to the next person. So we suggest working with friends and colleagues to make better sense of these articles when you are considering how to implement UNDRIP. Great. Back over to Kira.
Thanks for all the hard work translating the articles. You guys are going to get a bit of a break from participating and get to listen to me while I share about our workplace Hotıì ts'eeda, the NWT SPOR Support Unit. Thank you. So Hotıì ts'eeda is a Quechua word that refers to working together for good health. Hotıì ts'eeda exists as a support center to connect community members, organizations, and researchers in the NWT. And this is all in the goal to support recognition of NWT health research priorities and ultimately in development of a health system that is culturally competent and inclusive of traditional knowledge and Indigenous ways of knowing, being, and doing. All of Hotıì ts'eeda's work is guided by UNDRIP.
To understand Hotıì ts'eeda, we need to take a look at the context in which this SPOR unit exists. 50% of the population of the NWT is Indigenous. Given the health disparities between Indigenous and non-Indigenous people in the Northwest Territories, Hotıì ts'eeda focuses on Indigenous people's health and wellness by building on Indigenous strengths. We strive to build NWT capacity, contributing to improved health policy and outcomes. Among the Indigenous populations, there is representation across the territory from First Nations, Métis, and Inuvialuit communities. Yellowknife is home to half of the territory's population and serves as the territory's administrative hub. The remaining half of the population is spread over 1 million square kilometers across 33 communities. Each of these communities has its own unique characteristics, culture, and history. At the same time, All of these communities share characteristics such as remoteness, small size, and close proximity to land and water. Furthermore, NWT communities experience significant and rapid impacts from climate change, shifts in the economy, and other social and cultural changes. UNDRIP is particularly important to the Northwest Territories because it exists on Indigenous land and has a majority Indigenous population. Indigenous governments have already begun implementing UNDRIP in many ways, including through asserting and protecting land rights, establishing protected areas, asserting intellectual property rights to Indigenous knowledge, and ensuring the use of free and prior informed consent protocols and policies.
Knowing this and knowing what Hotıì ts'eeda's goal is to support health and wellness in the NWT, what does UNDRIP have to do with health? We hear in the news how Indigenous peoples have experienced harm in Canada, both in the past and ongoing today. This happens because Indigenous peoples' human rights are often not respected, and that lack of respect is built into the very systems and institutions themselves. Canada has built institutions and systems based on laws, policies, and practices that continue to be harmful to Indigenous peoples today. For change to take place, institutions and systems in Canada need to respect the Articles of UNDRIP. This requires us to look at what we have and ask, does it meet the standards of UNDRIP? What do we need to change to meet those standards?
Perfect. Ełet'anıts'eah. I hope at this point we've made it clear that UNDRIP is important to Indigenous people's health and well-being. Hotıì ts'eeda devotes much of our work to implementing UNDRIP through the project that we call Ełet'anıts'eah. Ełet'anıts'eah is a Clichon word meaning we rely on one another for strength. This is thought of as similar to the top of a teepee where all the poles of the teepee structure meet. Hotıì ts'eeda is engaging in an NWT-wide knowledge sharing project based on UNDRIP. The overarching goal of this work is to increase the implementation of UNDRIP across the territory. This research project emerged as a result of feedback from community partners at multiple annual gatherings. Specifically, community members identified a need for decision makers to improve health equity, access, and cultural safety. So Hotıì ts'eeda convened a territorial advisory committee to guide the project planning. The committee was made up of Indigenous government staff, and the approach included an environmental scan and knowledge sharing sessions with key stakeholders.
The results of the Ełet'anıts'eah are comprehensive and a testament to the community partners who invested in this work, and we thank them for it. The key stakeholders co-developed learning and implementation resources for UNDRIP, all of which you can find on Hotıì ts'eeda's website, NWTSPOR.ca. Internally at Hotıì ts'eeda, we apply UNDRIP in all areas of our work. We are embedded within an Indigenous government, the Clichon government. We are guided by a governing council with Indigenous governmental representation from across the territory, and Clichon elder Dr. John B. Zoe has a chair on that governing council. This guidance and direction from Indigenous governments and elders informs the what and the how of our work in Indigenous health and research. This is implementing UNDRIP through self-determination and self-governing rights and the right to preserve knowledge. We also work with elders to use traditional languages in the naming of our projects. We bring together community members annually to set Hotıì ts'eeda's priorities for the coming year, and we host workshops such as this one. Hotıì ts'eeda offers support to community researchers, ensuring research is directed by the community. We ask our external project partners who are seeking support from Hotıì ts'eeda to mindfully consider how their project applies specific UNDRIP articles. You should all have a copy in front of you of our funding guidelines. It looks like that you can see on the slide, maybe not. This is one of the products of the knowledge sharing sessions with Indigenous communities that Hotıì ts'eeda held. This is what we ask our external project partners to use in their own self-assessment of how their project is applying UNDRIP. And this is also a tool that Hotıì ts'eeda staff use in making funding decisions as we support projects that are implementing UNDRIP. The articles in the handout were selected with guidance from our advisory council. What they did was chose articles most relevant to Hotıì ts'eeda's context as a support unit for Indigenous health research. So the articles listed are largely related to health. Not all the articles might apply to each project, which is totally okay. And you'll notice a category at the bottom that is open to folks naming other articles that their work may adhere to as well. So if you have the handout in front of you, that'll bring us to our next activity.
Fabulous. So we are at our final activity, but it is a two-part activity, and there will be encouragement from Kira and I to engage in group discussion. I've already seen you guys doing that. I'm not worried in the slightest. So for this activity, we're going to be considering how our respective workplaces may or may not be implementing UNDRIP. For the first part, I suspect you guys will engage in group discussion, but you don't have to at this point. What you'll need is a pen, paper, handout with the handout that Kira was just referring to, laptop, phone, however you want to take your notes is fine. And you might also want the calls to action booklet, but you don't have to go through that at this point. We are going to ask you to think about a project, policy, or process, program, some feature of your workplace, and consider how does or doesn't this feature of your workplace apply UNDRIP. Refer to the guiding questions on that handout, and we'll give you 5 to 10 minutes depending on how it's going for everybody. Again, not all of the articles will apply. That's okay. And it's not expected that any initiative you choose complies with every single article of the declaration. So before I send you off for 5 to 10 minutes, are there any questions? Not seeing any. Great. Off you go. I will come down and circulate as well in case anybody has questions for us. Yeah, I think so. I knew that was going to happen. Hi again, everybody. So it sounds like you've already moved into this phase, but if you haven't started talking to a neighbor or Kira or myself, please do so. We are adding one additional question to your discussion. How could the feature of your workplace that you've chosen be adapted, be changed so that it does apply UNDRIP? The hope here is that you leave this workshop with at least one takeaway, one actionable item for your life or for your workplace. So sorry to interrupt, but you've got another 5 or so minutes of conversation. All right. I'm back. We're back. I'm staying up here now. So the last part of this activity before we close out the whole workshop is an opportunity for one person from your table to share with the larger group a little bit about your discussion. It doesn't have to be everything that you talked about. It doesn't even have to be about each of your workplaces specifically. Anything you'd like to share, a reflection about your discussion with us. I also want to take a moment to just apologize to the folks that are online who may be feeling excluded. I realize this workshop is not the most accessible to this hybrid model. I've been making mental notes about how to improve that. For now, if anybody is online and wants to put something in the chat or maybe come off of mute, I'm looking at Gunta, that looks like it's possible. You are also more than welcome, and I am just so sorry that this wasn't done a little bit better. For now, are there any groups that want to share with us? Y'all have gotten so quiet. My gosh, I see a hand over here. Thank you. And I didn't let you know that Brandon will be coming around with a new piece of reciprocity. So, stickers for that table. Way to go.
Say, Claire, I truly appreciate that little Texan that comes out of you with the y'alls.
Yeah, so Michelle and I were talking that we're lucky to be a part of a project that's very much Indigenous led and Indigenous run and focused on improving Indigenous health when it comes to vaccination and vaccine decision making. And so when we go through these UNDRIP articles, the majority of them I think our project is in line with. And the one place that we thought that there could be some room for improvement is focusing on that traditional knowledge and cultural heritage piece, where I think thus far, at least in the conversations that I've been in, there hasn't been a lot of conversation about what maybe the traditional medicine equivalent of vaccination or traditional knowledge around vaccinations might look like. And I think that that would be a positive benefit to our project.
Amazing. Thank you for sharing that. And thank you for talking so openly about where your project can improve. I know that can be a little bit vulnerable, especially if our employers or people with more power are sitting in the room as well. So thank you. Yeah, that's great. I see another hand up at the back, but Davita's already on it. Superstar.
Hi, we were talking about we might be involved in different projects where we do apply all of these articles, and it's great and successful, but the reality is the system itself, sometimes it ends up feeling like tokenism, like you're just like slapping up a piece of First Nations artwork, or it's last minute, or there isn't a budget for those things, so you have to fundraise it yourself. Like it's actually not a real system change yet. We were talking about sort of the manipulative ways that we, find out what we need to make these things successful and then go find some neuroscience to support it. Or I know for us, I have used UNDRIP before, or, Truth and Reconciliation, or just talk to people about like human rights, which is good, but also creates tension sometimes in the workplace as well. So I think we're getting momentum, but we're not there yet.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that. Some of the points you were talking about at the beginning, I think were reflected in some of the discussion yesterday, particularly from Firelight. Did I get that right? The group that presented yesterday. It's so important to have that meaningful engagement. I love to hear that you've relied on UNDRIP before in some of your work practices, and that you feel like it's gaining momentum. I share that. I also think it's gaining momentum. We're seeing that with different provincial and territorial governments signing on to UNDRIP, and that is something that has come up in these discussions different times that we run these workshops, people talking about not really having power in their organization to make that broader systemic change that you're talking about. And what I try to inspire people with is, for now, that's okay, because we've got to start somewhere, and any work you can do as an individual to learn about UNDRIP, to be ready for when that window opens, is so good and needed as well. It's unfortunate that it does take so long for these systems to change and reflect people's needs. I'm noticing the time. We are going to wrap up now. I'm so sorry if there's other folks that wanted to share. I don't think anybody else online wanted to share. Again, we will make this better for the hybrid model. What do we have left for you? Oh, a question, comment. Yeah, please, sorry.
Just because, I guess, just because the Yukon's a little bit different from other First Nations in the aspect that we are a government entity, so we have a lot more input about how things are organized and done through the, so I'm just wondering how that affects these calls to action. And I know, because I don't think a lot, I'm looking at some of the stuff and I'm like, I don't think a lot of my colleagues have seen this stuff, or, where even such things as where I had to fight previous supervisors, not current ones right now, but about taking a language course at the college. and saying how important that was for me to do that as part of my work, and them not getting it. But it was also, but there's other policies that I could follow, but not even looking at this. It's like, it's in here. I have a right to learn my language. So I don't know.
No, absolutely. Sorry, am I understanding that you work within an Indigenous government, but you still had to fight to get traction for that right of yours to learn your language? I'm just a little bit surprised to hear that. Absolutely, UNDRIP can also guide the work that Indigenous governments are doing. Hopefully, we made that clear that Clichon government is using UNDRIP to guide their work. I would love to chat with you more about your experiences after this, if you would like. Yeah, thank you for sharing that as well. I see our beater is waiting to come in, so we're gonna keep this snappy. And now what, there is a half page in front of you with some questions on one side and some QR codes on the other side. This is a little take-home resource for you, along with everything else that's on the tables. You can take it home. Please consider your answers to these questions over the next few days. Bring them up with friends that you've met at this workshop, at this conference, or with other people that you work and live with. The last piece of paper I will chat with you about is the evaluation. We would love if you could provide a little bit of feedback about what you thought about this workshop, and particularly how you think this workshop can be improved. There is a bag on the table for you to fold those evaluations up and leave them with us. We will review them and make those improvements. I'm going to turn it over to Kira for some final messages.
In summary, UNDRIP outlines Indigenous peoples' rights that must be upheld internationally. It's the result of years of advocacy and leadership. It aims to mend gaps in Indigenous rights, not create new standards of rights. UNDRIP can be used as a tool to evaluate how Indigenous rights are and are not being met. There's still much work to be done, and we all have something to contribute regarding implementing UNDRIP.
Thank you so much, everybody. QR code again, if you'd like to learn more about us, please keep in touch. That's it. Merci.
Merci.